Hello everyone and welcome back to my office. I am here at home because I am actually going to be out of the office and off campus tomorrow all day. So I unfortunately will not be available for my office hours as I normally am, but feel free to email or text. I received an email today that sort of indicated to me that there was nothing on Brightspace for you in almost a week. And I thought, wow, that's really problematic because I recorded a video last week for you and clearly it did not get put up. So since it is 4 or 5 days later and we're moving right into the next piece, I thought I would just re-record what I talked about in that video for you as we get into Cicero coming off of the Rhetorica ad Herrenium. So that is what we're going to do tonight, and you'll have this by tomorrow, as is par for the course. And on Thursday you should have another video. If you don't, please let me know. I know I told you to give me a little bit of grace, but I really didn't know that nothing was put up last Thursday, so my apologies for that, but we're going to be able to catch up pretty quickly. I think that the Rhetorica ad Herrenium, forgive my pronunciation of things tonight, a lot of it is in Latin, and I'm not the best at speaking Latin despite my training when I was younger. So hopefully you'll just be able to follow me along, because the book, the Rhetorica ad Herrenium as a piece, was always attributed to Cicero, and probably until honestly I started teaching, that's who it was attributed to. Only later did we start to realize that it probably wasn't written by Cicero, and in fact Cicero's work builds from it, or it was a prelude to Cicero's work really more than anything else. So it's an important piece for a couple of reasons. First of all, obviously it describes in great detail the three levels of style that Cicero talks about, and that we'll talk about as you read him. But the other thing that it does, and this is incredibly important, is it lays out the structure of argument. Now, if you'll remember from the beginning, Aristotle gave us sort of a layout for inductive reasoning and for deductive reasoning, especially through the syllogism. In the Rhetorica ad Herrenium, it acknowledges that the layout of an argument is a little bit more complex, that in order to communicate it properly to an audience, you need to be able to break down each of the pieces and the functions of that argument. In other words, what it's really doing is talking about that point of stasis that we mentioned earlier in the semester. I can't believe we're in week 4 already. The time is just flying by. But earlier we talked about the fact that the structure of argument can be incredibly easy to understand if we simplify it into a syllogism, but there's a lot of problems with that, right? So in this work, we get all of the pieces of how to put an argument together and the definitions of each of those pieces. In other words, we're talking about what to do when stasis begins. In other words, we're talking about the beginning of rhetoric at the point of stasis. So I did take notes this time around because, like I said, it's in Latin. So I always have to make sure I look at it. Now, one of the first things you're going to notice, aside from the commentary on style, is that they also talk about, and I say they because I mean we really don't know who the author is, but they talk about sort of the 3 types of speaking. And you'll notice that these align very, very closely with Aristotle's 3 genres of rhetoric, right? So we have the forensic, talking about the past, putting it back together. We've got the deliberative, talking about what we're going to do. Particularly, I referred to legislation or Congress in this point. And then finally, epideictic or ceremonial, where we're just, where we're praising or accusing or defending someone. Particularly through a eulogy is the best example that we've had so far. Now, according to this work, in the Latin, we get it as demonstrativum, deliberativum, and ludicia. And I'll be honest with you, I have no idea if I'm pronouncing those correctly or not, and I'm not going to ask you to spell them. I just want you to understand that those three are exactly reflective of what Aristotle said. So the Rhetorica ad Herrenium comes directly from his work. So then it breaks out what they call the parts or the steps of an argument, and we're going to see this again where people try to sort of pull apart what steps need to be taken in order to have a successful argument, and it'll look a little different. In fact, it'll be a little easier to understand. But for us, exordium, narratio, divisio, confirmatio, refutatio, and conclusio, which aren't that hard to figure out what those mean, just what they sound like. And in your book, they're pretty clear about these definitions, as these are part of an argument. Now, why is it important for us to understand the parts of an argument? Mainly because, a lot of places that use this are law schools. Law schools use a lot of what is known as, quote, the stasis system. Not the definition of stasis, okay? Stasis is that point where rhetoric begins, according to Aristotle. It's that point of equilibrium between equally opposing viewpoints, ideas, or concepts. But when we talk about the stasis system, we're talking about how to play out, essentially, dialectic through rhetoric. Okay, and that stasis system is the basis for all of our sort of courtroom rhetoric. So when lawyers are taught, they are taught this very specific way of questioning and reasoning and responding to answers with another question in order to get to the point that they want to get to. And I'll be honest with you, this part of the law of lawyering, I should say, I understand extremely well. The part I can't wrap my head around is that the law is inherently strict, and it is to be followed to the letter. And the letter of that law is what we follow the most. And so if you've been following anything in the news with all of the court decisions that have come down recently, from the Supreme Court all the way down to the state courts for President Trump, for example, you will notice that it is excruciatingly slow, and there's these pieces that they keep referring back to. The law says, the law says, the law in New York, the law in DC, the law in Georgia versus the law of the Supreme Court. All of those function at the level of what's in the language, the word of the law. I am way too pragmatic to be a lawyer. In other words, I always look at the situation and I say, well, what makes sense here? Not what follows the law, but what makes sense here. In other words, I'd be a god-awful lawyer. And I'm, by the way, incredibly hard to work with, according to our lawyer. So, and I understand that. I like to think that judicial action takes into account all of the possible, the realm of possibilities for how a law may be interpreted. But that's not what lawyers do. Okay, and that's not what judges do. So in that case, we must look just at the letter of the law, and the stasis system is a way that we might argue with the letter of the law in mind in order to get the result that we want to get, particularly if there is a question, a probability, if rhetorical action is actually being taken by a jury specifically, and sometimes just by a single judge. It's unfortunate that most of the court cases I've been involved with have not been about proving something wrong or right so much as or true or false, as it's been about proving something that is the better decision over another decision. And that's not the way that the law works. It doesn't generally work as in what's the best situation for a person? What's the best answer to this particular problem? Instead, a lot of the law that you see on TV or that we hear about is proving someone guilty or innocent. And I don't usually end up in court for those reasons. It's usually a matter of a legal contract or something like that. So there's a very different practice to contract law, to family law, than there is to criminal law, for example. Understanding what arguments need to be made and what style to use in the various positions of stasis, is what the Rhetorica ad Herrenium really talks about. And the question is why is it called the Rhetorica ad Herrenium? It literally translates to, I believe, rhetoric to or towards what they call Herrenium, which is another way of saying the word or the name. And there's a couple of people who think that perhaps it was from I can't remember who they really attribute it to before or after Cicero. I've heard a number of people mentioned as to who it could be, and then I think I read something somewhere that said it could just have been a random doctor, in other words, a random teacher who wrote this piece. But it's an important piece to understanding argument. It's not an important piece to understanding public argument, but it is an important piece to understanding courtroom argument. So that's what that's there for. It's also to set us up for the coming work that we're going to read on modern interpretations of argument. So keep it in mind. What does that have to do with us moving into the Roman era? Between the fall of Greece and the rise of Rome, the Roman Republic, there's about 200 years. So really between Aristotle and Cicero, we're looking at about 200 years that have gone by. The Rhetorica ad Herrenium is the one piece that I know the best from that time period that has been preserved. The only other one that I'm really familiar with is On the Sublime by Longinus, and I'm not making us read that for a number of reasons, but mainly because those are the only two pieces over 200 years that we've really found address the issue of rhetoric. And Longinus he actually talks more about the pleasure of speaking, the pleasure of being able to persuade someone else or a group of people. So I don't really think that's necessarily super important for you all right now, but feel free to read it if you want to. For now, we're going to move right into Rome, and we are going to cover two basic parts of the Roman history. It's going to be the Roman Republic, and then we'll go into the Roman Empire. Now, the Roman Republic is exactly what it sounds like. It's a democratic system, okay? Don't let anyone ever tell you that we don't live in a democracy, we live in a republic. That is a ludicrous statement, and here's why. There are different types of democratic governments. There are different types of democracies. One of those democracies might be a monarchical democracy in which there is a king and a queen, but there are houses of the people that are represented, for example, Parliament. So you can see I'm getting at Great Britain here and Canada and Australia. Okay, those are monarchical democracies for the most part. The monarchs are figureheads, and mostly they're supposed to go by the will of the people, okay? For our case, we're in a republic. We're in a democratic republic. And what does that mean? Well, it's not a direct democracy, because that wouldn't succeed. A direct democracy like what they describe in ancient Greece, which really wasn't as great as we like to think it was, the idea that everyone who needs to have a say has a say. Turns out that it was a very limited number of people who got to have a say, and as we've grown in our human existence, we've learned that is not possible when you have several million, hundreds of millions of people all deciding on one thing. That's nearly impossible. So we have a representative system, right? We send people to represent us to the government, and that's what our two houses are. That's what really the president is supposed to do. It is a service to the people. They are in our service, meaning that they are to serve us, not the other way around. And that is a democratic republic. That is the only thing that distinguishes something that we call a republic, is that it is a set of representatives that are representing the people, that are supposed to serve the people. Now, in the Roman Republic, we know that this was the case, and they had one ruling house, and that one ruling house was the Senate. And there was no singular power. There was certainly like sort of a Speaker of the House or Vice President sort of position in the Senate that just kept the Senate going, but it wasn't a decisive figure. It was not a decision maker. It was not the one who broke the ties necessarily. It was the person who made the discussion amongst the senators happen. So that's why the Roman Republic is called that, is because it is in fact a democratic republic. All right. Now, do we have questions about how many people were actually represented by the senators? Of course we do. We still have that question now. We know that in our two-party republic that no one person represents the entirety of the group of people that they represent, because we have two parties at least, if not more. And for example, in the state of Missouri, we have two senators. We have Senator Schmidt and Senator Hawley. And I can tell you for certain, I know people that those two don't represent in the Senate. They represent the majority of the people in Missouri, but there's going to be a whole group that they don't represent. So the question of a republic and whether or not it actually represents the will of the people is determined by who is elected into positions to represent the larger group of people. I hope that makes sense. That's why we have elections. The elections are where we as citizens are allowed to choose who's going to represent us, right? And one of the things we're running into now in our sort of postmodernized, not postmodern, but postmodernized democracy is that more and more people are playing party politics. In other words, we're only interested in what the party platform is or what the party line is, and we're not paying attention to the individuals representing us. And that's where this incredibly large division occurs in the United States, that we're pulling further and further away, not because of individuals who represent us so much as because of the party system. So if you ever want to take a government class, there's a good topic for you to discuss. That's certainly not what's important to us in this class, but what is important to us in this class is how to persuade not just the people who already agree with us to follow us or that we can represent them properly so we get elected, but to hopefully persuade as many people as possible to see things the way that we see things. This act of persuasion, of understanding all the means of persuasion in this instance of the government and the people, is the practice of rhetoric. So Cicero, who we might or might not know who that is, but if you want to know some silly little facts about Cicero, one of them is that his name means chickpea. It was a nickname that was given to him because he resembled an uncle who had a bump on his nose that looked like a chickpea. What are you going to do? Cicero sounds a lot more regal than that, doesn't it? So anyway, that's a little tidbit of irrelevant trivia for you in case that ever comes up in a trivia game on trivia night. But Cicero, we know, did something very important. he arranged or organized and clarified the 5 canons of rhetoric. So while Aristotle certainly wrote about them, as did the others, Cicero takes all of the learnings from Aristotle and from others and puts them together into the 5 main rules of rhetoric, the 5 things that must be achieved properly and well in order to be successful in rhetoric. And those, of course, are invention, arrangement, style, memory, and delivery. I don't remember if your book actually cites delivery cites memory before style. Sometimes people switch those 2 up. It doesn't really matter. As long as you got the order of invention comes first, delivery comes last, generally I'm pretty happy. So why are these 5 so important? Why is delivery last? Why is invention first? All of them are equally important, but this is the order in which Aristotle talks about them, and so this is the order that Cicero put them in. The most important comes first, and that is invention. Not just what is my topic going to be, but what topic is going to suit my audience? How am I going to address this topic? This is where we go for our argumentation, both the inartificial and artificial. So the ethos, pathos, and logos of the subject matter that we're going to be talking about. It's not just about choosing a topic like you did in Com 115, but it's about finding the way you're going to address that topic. So you're considering already in invention, you're considering how this speech might play out before we even get to arranging the arguments. Okay? And that's the second one, which is arrangement. And I use the word arrangement on purpose because in 115 we call it organizing. What is the organization of your speech? And we have all these different ways of organizing. Spatial, linear, chronological, reverse chronological, whatever, problem solution. All of these different, quote, organizational patterns that we have. Arrangement is not just an organizational pattern, but instead it is arrangement of the argument that is going to help, or the arguments that are going to help your audience walk to your conclusion. So what is the best way to arrange my ideas so that it's easily followed and so that it makes sense and so that the audience follows along and inevitably comes to my conclusion? That's sort of the way that I look at arrangement, because it's a heck of a lot more than just, do I have an organizational pattern? Did I have transitions? Do I have an introduction and conclusion? It's a lot more than that. It's about how we get our audience from point A to point B, from the thesis statement to the persuasive act. The third I'm going to go ahead and say is style. Style, because this is how I learned them, right? Style, we, you may or may not know, are the 3 sort of levels of style that we might use to deliver a speech. And Cicero is very, very clear about this, that it is important that you choose the right style based on your audience and based on the subject matter that you're talking about. What are those 3 levels of style? The first one is called the grand style. Now, I want to be clear that all 3 levels of style are still formal speaking. These are for speeches. This is not an everyday conversation between you and your buddy going to lunch or whatever. This is literally a formal speech to a mass audience, a public speech, if you will. So those 3 levels of style, starting with grand. Grand literally means kind of what it sounds like, in the sense that you're talking about big gestures, like the arms flailing, the loud inflections in the voices, the dramatic changes in volume, the sometimes lyrical nature of the speech and what tropes you use in that speech. You know, it's all of the big things that I personally associate with certain speakers, particularly Joel Osteen. He is probably my favorite example of the grand style. The grand style is generally used when you're talking to people who already believe in you, already agree with you, but you're making it pretty, you're making it sound good, you're making it pleasant to be heard. So we're not really as focused on the argument as we are on merely the presentation of that argument. You might have heard the saying, preaching to the choir, right? It's when somebody says, hey, look, I already agree with you. You don't have to convince me. We're just talking about this, but, you know, I'm on your side here. That's sort of what that style is for. It's to make people feel good about the topic. Joel Osteen is my favorite example because I think televangelists have mastered this style. Agree with him or disagree with him, I'm not really sure, but I could say that the style-wise definitely fits Cicero's grand style. And I can also say with some certainty that Cicero gets into the nitty-gritty. I don't make you guys read all this, but at one point he actually talks about what kind of toga to wear for each of the styles. You know, I always thought that toga thing was kind of like a farcical way of looking at the Romans, but no, they wore them. And he even describes, in order to get attention for certain things, to disrobe. And I certainly don't agree with that, but okay, Cicero, whatever, you know, floats your boat. The next style I'm going to talk about is actually the common style, which is the quote-unquote lowest on the rack here. And so we've got this grand style, we've got this common style, and what we mean by common is still formal. It's not it's not street talk, it's not jive, it's not rapping. It is a formal public speech. Now, those are other art forms that certainly I think are effective and that people should use, but when we're talking about speaking for forensic, deliberative, or epidictic purposes, we are not talking about those things. But you may be speaking to people who don't have as high of an education in the subject matter as you do. And therefore you need to bring the conversation to them. So you look at your audience, because Cicero always says you start with your audience. Look at your audience. What do they know about what I'm about to speak on? And if they know very little, I need to educate them or inform them first. And so I need to use the language that they're going to understand. It can't just sound pretty. It can't just be inspirational. It has to teach them something, which means I need to speak in their language, in the commonly understood language of the audience. The third style is actually the one that comes between grand and common, and it's called middle style. And so it's between grand and common, a lot of people say. That's not exactly the best definition, but what I would say is that the middle style seeks to persuade and also to teach. So we are looking to not just simply teach, but it needs to be done in such a pleasing way that it might persuade your audience. So it takes some of the elements of the common style and some of the elements of the grand style and puts them together. You certainly can't use what my grandmother used to call 50-cent words, you know, the really big words, the really difficult to define terminology in the common style. Well, you can't use that in the middle style either. You have to make sure that your audience understands your language. At the same time, you can assume that they can be persuaded, that you're giving them enough information to then learn and be persuaded. So when people ask me for examples of these three, they particularly like to use, people always ask me what presidents do you put under each of these? Because historically, you might know some of these, the presidents of the recent past. So here's how I sort of talk about them. The grand style was really Barack Obama. In a lot of ways, he really adopted the big hand gestures, a lot of movement, the dramatic facial expressions, the fluctuation in his voice, sometimes to a point that it annoyed me, I'll be honest with you, but that that is the grand style of speaking. Another one that I might mention is Ronald Reagan. But of course, he almost predates me. He was elected when I was 6 years old. So I don't really expect you guys to know a whole lot about him necessarily, or his speaking style, I guess I should say. I doubt you're going home after high school on a Wednesday night and watching presidential speeches or something. But if you ever had a chance to watch him speak, he used a deep, booming voice. And when he was allowed to, he used gestures. A lot of times, really, he was one of the first truly all TV presidents, and so really we're seeing him, on a two-dimensional scale, and you're seeing him sitting in front of a teleprompter or standing in front of a teleprompter. So he didn't have the opportunity for the big grand gestures, but he certainly had the opportunity to use a language that elevated his speech a little bit more. For the middle, for the common, I'll go with common. For the common, I really do use George W. Bush and Bill Clinton. Both of them had a different style, but they were both in what I would call the common style. They used language to reach everyone that they could. A lot of people said, "Oh, I want to play saxophone with Bill Clinton. I want to have a beer with George W. Bush." That was a common phrase from people during those times. It just so happens that W followed Clinton, so it was like, 16 years of the what I would call the common style, and that's okay. People appreciated it. It was a change from the formality that we got from Ronald Reagan. And I would say in the middle, I'm going to put Jimmy Carter, and these are all back-to-back. I don't know why they're back-to-back, but they are. Jimmy Carter and George H.W. Bush. No, they're not back-to-back. I apologize. They are not. George H.W. Bush, of course, was the older Bush, number 41. And he had a style that was very formal, but used language that sort of a classroom teacher might use, as opposed to the language that his son used or Bill Clinton used, as opposed to what Reagan used. So it was not the grand gestures, but instead he was sort of right here. He lived right here. If you've ever seen the movie Hitch with what's his name, Fresh Prince of Bel-Air, Will Smith. If you watch that movie, he says, stay right here when you're dancing. Don't be going all over the place with your hands and your arms. And George H.W. was very, very clear in doing that. He was very formal and rigid in doing that, but his language was generally very understandable. No one was saying, "I feel like he's talking down to me," whereas people had said that about Ronald Reagan and Barack Obama, definitely. So hopefully that gives you some idea of sort of what the grand, middle, and common style would look like. And literally in style, in the canon of style, it was so important for Cicero that you understand your audience and base your style off of them, that he goes on about it ad nauseum. Let's be honest. It's a little bit too much sometimes, but he does take time for the other four canons. So let's go to number 4. Number 4, I would say, is memory. Now, it is true that back in the times of ancient Greece and ancient Rome and through the early Middle Ages, that we didn't have newspapers, obviously. We didn't have TVs. We didn't have ways of communicating like that. So what we would do is we would send somebody, say, to the Senate and say, go find out what the great speeches are, and then you guys spread out and go to all the small towns and hamlets and communities and re-deliver the point of that speech. A lot of people said, okay, well, that meant memorizing the speech, but that's not what that means. It's not about reciting from memory. It's about being able to replicate in memoria, replicate the general idea and understanding that the speech was supposed to replicate. So that's what you get from memory. It's really about rehearsing the tradition of speech. It's not about memorization. Hopefully that's clear. When the president says something and that gets filtered through, I don't know, a newscaster, and that gets filtered through your friends, and it comes down to someone explaining it to you, right? That's memoria. What is the track of the point? And, you know, we all know from playing the game telephone or from something like that, that messages get garbled in translation. And more importantly, they get garbled in interpretation. And that's why memory is such an important part of rhetoric and the 5 canons. Last but not least, we have delivery. This does not mean that it's not important. This does not mean it's the least important, but it does mean it's the least important if you can't do the first 4. Because if your content isn't good, it does not matter how well you deliver the speech. The most effective speeches and speakers are not just about using a particular style or making a particular argument. It's about creating an argument or a position or a thesis, finding the ways to present that, structuring that arrangement of those arguments, using the correct style for your audience, making sure that you absolutely do give them the information that they need to get, and then doing it in a way that is effective. So this is the nonverbals, this is the paralanguage, right? Rate of speech, hand gestures. This is the facial expressions that you make. You'll notice whenever I record these videos, I know I do this. I always look up, right? I'm always looking up. Part of that is because I put the camera there, but mostly it's because I'm pulling out of the air from my memory, right? I look up and to the right. I'm looking for my memory, okay? People who look up when they're speaking generally do that. Their eyes go up because they're looking for the reminder of what it is that they want to say. They're making sure that they replicate the point that they want to make. And as you can see, for some people like myself, sometimes I have to repeat things 5 times for me to understand that I got the point across to you. That's my job, right? So you'll see me look up a lot. You'll see other speakers look up a lot, that practice of memory. But we also make eye contact because that is an important part of the delivery as well. So all of the nonverbals, all of the paralanguage, that goes into delivery. If you don't have content to deliver, then you're not going to be successful. If you don't have good delivery for good content, you're not going to be successful. So all 5 of them are keys. Now, some other tidbits of information that Cicero gives us that I want you to understand. Cicero really did place rhetoric in the educational system. He made it part of the way that we were to learn. It was originally one of 5 R's, if you will. I don't understand why reading, writing, and arithmetic, as people say, are the 3 R's of our education system. That's not actually anywhere close to accurate, but there were originally 5, and rhetoric was one of them. And so the practice of rhetoric to Cicero was so important and key to our educational system, not just for students, but for teachers as well, right? Because our job is to interpret for you difficult concepts and ideas in order for you to learn. So essentially what we do every time that we stand up to speak, or we record a video, or we answer a question, is we're practicing rhetoric. That's our job, is to make it palatable, make it possible for you to understand what you're supposed to learn. In that, Cicero also says that before you speak, you should know everything that there is to know about your subject matter. Everything. Not that you need to know everything in the world, but everything about your subject matter and those things related to it, you need to know before you can talk about it. Because if you don't, you're more likely to mislead your audience, and that would be bad. The other thing that Cicero says that's key is that that individuals should learn rhetoric from the time they're born. He goes so far as to say the wet nurses, that is the nurses, and today we would call them nannies, I guess, the people who help raise our children, the people who feed our children from birth on. You need to make sure that they can speak well. In other words, he did not believe that you should lean over a crib and go, gaga, goo goo, mama, dada, baby, that kind of thing. He was not up for baby talk. He believed that we should start as early as possible to expose them to the language that they're going to be using as human beings when they grow. And I tend to agree with that. I've got one brother I've got 2 brothers, but I've got one who has 5 children. We are definitely Catholic, Irish, and Italian. And those 5 children, I could tell you, super smart kids because their parents are both brilliant. But the 5th one, she knows way more than all of the others combined. And I don't mean in intelligence, I mean in just knowledge of how to communicate it. Because she has been hearing it all her life. When she was born, the oldest was 10. So, and the second oldest was 9. So they were speaking very clear English. There was never any baby talk with Emma. She was, coming out of the gate saying words like, not just cookie, but full sentences, like, please give me a cookie. She was so engrossed and surrounded by these people speaking in the traditional way of communicating that she never even had a baby talk stage. Do I think that's better? I have no idea. I can tell you that she outsmarts all of us, and because she's the youngest, because she's the baby, she also tends to outrun all of us, and good for her. So there is evidence to suggest that talking to your child in very clear terms, in very enunciated words, is better than using baby talk. I disagree with it on one thing, and that is phonics. Learning phonetically the words that you need to say. That wasn't really a thing in ancient Greece and ancient Rome, so that wasn't something that they could, grab onto in order to teach language. I happen to think that phonics are very, very important, and they've helped me, although not with my Latin, as I demonstrated earlier in this video. All right, everybody, that is definitely long enough for this week. I apologize that you did not have a video on Thursday, but I can't find it, and if I can't find it, you can't find it for sure. So that means I needed to do this for you tonight. Continue to read. Hopefully you'll find it somewhat enjoyable. A lot of people say that Cicero wrote the first public speaking textbook. Well, what did Quintilian write then when he's writing during the Roman Empire? We're going to talk about that next time. All right, everybody, have a great week, and I'll see you on the flip side.